In the dark corridors of history, some names echo with a chilling resonance. One such name is Jane Toppan, better known as Jolly Jane. To her patients, she was a kind, cheerful nurse with a warm smile. But behind that charm lurked a secret so sinister it would shock an entire nation. Tonight, we uncover the story of a woman who poisoned not just bodies, but trust itself. This is the story of the nurse who claimed at least 31 lives for pleasure. Jane was not always called Jane. She was born as Honora Kelly in Boston, Massachusetts in 1854. Her childhood was anything but normal. Her father, an Irish immigrant, was an abusive alcoholic. People in the neighborhood knew him for his erratic behavior. Some even whispered that he was insane. Jane's mother died young, leaving the children in the hands of a man unfit to raise them. Eventually, the situation grew so desperate that Jane and her sisters were sent to an orphanage. But life at the orphanage was not kind either. Soon, Jane was placed as an indentured servant in the home of the Toppan family. There, she took on their last name, but not their love. To the outside world, she seemed cheerful, polite, and eager to please. Inside, however, she began to harbor deep feelings of abandonment, resentment, and jealousy. These emotions would later shape the twisted motives behind her crimes. As Jane grew older, her ability to charm people became her greatest weapon. Neighbors and acquaintances often described her as talkative, funny, even lovable. She would tell elaborate stories about her childhood, making herself sound like she came from a respectable family. The truth, of course, was much darker, but Jane had already learned the art of deception. By her early 20s, Jane decided to pursue nursing. At the time, nursing was a respected profession for women, and hospitals welcomed anyone who was willing to take on the difficult, often thankless work. For Jane, this was the perfect environment. It gave her access to vulnerable patients, unquestioned trust from colleagues, and the opportunity to experiment with something that fascinated her deeply: life and death. At first, Jane's colleagues noticed nothing unusual. She was friendly, she made jokes, and she comforted patients. Many even admired her dedication. But behind the cheerful mask, Jane was beginning to experiment. She had discovered that as a nurse, she had access to medicines like morphine and atropine, powerful drugs that could sedate, paralyze, and, in the right doses, kill. Jane's twisted curiosity led her to start testing these drugs on her patients. She didn't do it to relieve suffering. No, Jane wanted to watch. She wanted to study the effects of life slowly fading away. She wanted to play God. And so, the woman once known as cheerful, Jolly Jane began her descent into becoming one of America's most terrifying serial killers. As Jane settled into her role as a nurse, her reputation among her colleagues and patients began to grow. People described her as caring and dedicated. She had a way of making patients laugh, of making them feel safe, even when their conditions were dire. Her cheerful personality earned her the nickname Jolly Jane. But behind the warm smile, she was already thinking about something darker. During her early training at the Cambridge Hospital, Jane discovered that few people paid attention to the exact doses of medication being administered. Nurses were trusted completely, and doctors rarely questioned their judgment. This gave Jane the freedom she craved. It was during this time that her fascination with life and death evolved into something more sinister. She began experimenting with morphine and atropine, two drugs that, when used correctly, could relieve pain or stabilize a patient. But in higher doses, they became deadly. Morphine slowed the body down, dulling breathing and consciousness. Atropine, on the other hand, sped up the heart, and created chaos within the system. Jane learned that by combining the two, she could create a terrifying dance between life and death. A patient would slip into unconsciousness, then suddenly wake in pain, before finally succumbing. And Jane would sit at their bedside, watching every moment, savoring every reaction. Her first known experiments were subtle. She would give slightly larger doses than prescribed, watching carefully as patients became groggy or disoriented. She grew bolder with time. Soon, she was administering lethal doses, then pretending to rush in and comfort the patient as they struggled for breath. She later confessed that she found immense pleasure in holding her victims during their final moments. For her, it was not just about killing, it was about control, about power, about playing God with the lives entrusted to her. One of her early victims was a patient she was supposed to be caring for at Cambridge Hospital. The death seemed natural, but Jane knew it was her doing. The thrill was intoxicating. She had discovered a dark secret. She could end a life, and no one would ever suspect her. By the late 1880s, Jane's career had shifted between hospitals, including Massachusetts General Hospital. Wherever she went, mysterious deaths seemed to follow. Patients who were stable suddenly declined. Those who should have recovered died without explanation. Yet no one pointed a finger at Jane. After all, she was cheerful, attentive, and appeared heartbroken when patients passed away. But Jane's ambitions went beyond hospitals. Once she left institutional work, she began working as a private nurse. This allowed her to choose her patients and operate without oversight, and it was in private homes that her crimes truly escalated. She poisoned elderly patients in her care, often those with no close family. She manipulated households, ingratiating herself into their lives, and then slowly eliminating those who trusted her most. What made her particularly dangerous was her charm. People welcomed her into their homes, believing she was there to help. In reality, they were inviting death itself through their door. Jane's killings were not random. Sometimes she murdered for money, hoping to take over the belongings or wills of her patients. Other times, she killed simply to satisfy her urges. She admitted later that she loved being in control, watching the life drain out of someone's eyes, feeling them cling to her as if she were their savior, even though she was their executioner. This dual identity, the kind nurse and the cold-blooded killer, made Jane nearly invisible to suspicion. Doctors trusted her. Families adored her. Patients felt safe in her hands. No one could imagine that the woman they called Jolly Jane was, in fact, systematically poisoning those she was supposed to heal. And with every life she took, her confidence grew stronger, her methods more daring. Jane Toppan was no longer just a nurse. She was a predator, hiding in plain sight. As the years went by, Jane's hunger for control only grew stronger. What began as quiet experiments inside hospital walls soon transformed into a personal obsession. By the 1890s, she was no longer satisfied with occasional victims. She wanted more deaths, more power, more moments where she alone decided between life and death. Working as a private nurse gave her the perfect hunting ground. She had full access to patients, their families, and their trust. No one questioned her when she mixed medicines or when she insisted on caring for patients alone. Behind closed doors, Jane began to create her own stage of cruelty. She would carefully select her victims, sometimes wealthy elderly patients whose estates she hoped to manipulate, sometimes friends or acquaintances who had no idea of the darkness behind her smile. She poisoned not only those under her care, but also those around them, anyone who might interfere with her control. Entire households began to collapse under her presence, one member after another falling sick, then dying. But Jane's crimes were not motivated only by money. In her later confessions, she admitted that her killings brought her pleasure, even excitement. She described climbing into bed with her victims as they drifted between life and death, holding them close as their bodies twitched and their breathing slowed. It was not enough for her to kill. She wanted to feel their final moments, to be the last person they saw before the darkness consumed them. One of her most notorious victims was her foster sister, Elizabeth. Jane had always been jealous of her, jealous of her stable life, her marriage, her place in the world. Elizabeth had never suspected the depth of Jane's resentment. When Jane offered her a picnic in 1899, Elizabeth agreed, trusting her sister completely. They sat together, eating, laughing, drinking, and within hours, Elizabeth was dead, poisoned by the very person who claimed to love her. To Jane, this murder was not only satisfying, but deeply personal. She had finally taken away the one person who stood as a reminder of her painful childhood. After that, Jane's killings accelerated. She murdered elderly patients she nursed in their homes, then targeted members of the Davis family, a family that had once welcomed her in. Over the course of her stay, she poisoned multiple family members, one after another. What shocked investigators later was how casually she shifted from being a caregiver to a killer, smiling during the day and preparing lethal doses at night. By now, whispers were starting to grow. Too many deaths seemed to follow Jane wherever she went. Families who had hired her were left devastated, their relatives mysteriously passing away in her care. But she remained untouchable. Doctors respected her. Communities trusted her. Who could believe that the cheerful, caring, jolly Jane was hiding such monstrous desires? It was only after the Davis family deaths that suspicion finally grew too strong to ignore. Relatives began questioning how healthy family members had suddenly died under Jane's watch. Autopsies were performed, and for the first time, traces of poison were uncovered. The evidence pointed directly to the woman who had seemed the most devoted. When investigators finally confronted Jane, the mask began to crack. At first, she denied everything, insisting that she was innocent. But under pressure, she began to confess, not to one or two murders, but to dozens. She calmly admitted to killing at least 31 people, and possibly more. She described her methods with chilling detail, explaining how she used morphine and atropine to toy with her victims, how she gained satisfaction from watching their final struggles. Her confession shocked the nation. A nurse, a profession associated with healing, with kindness, had turned into one of America's most prolific female serial killers. Newspapers across the country carried the story of Jolly Jane, the woman who wore a smile while taking lives. Yet even in her confessions, Jane showed no remorse. She did not weep for her victims or regret her actions. Instead, she spoke as if describing a pastime, something she enjoyed and perfected. For her, murder was not a crime. It was an art, a personal obsession, and a source of pleasure. When she was finally arrested, the community that had once admired her was left in disbelief. How could someone so ordinary, so trusted, hide such extraordinary darkness? The cheerful nurse, who had charmed her patients, was revealed as a predator, a woman who poisoned for pleasure, for power, and for the thrill of playing God. The investigation into Jane Toppan's crimes was unlike anything the authorities of the time had ever faced. Poison was a subtle weapon, and in the late 1800s, toxicology was still a developing science. But in Jane's case, there were simply too many deaths, too many coincidences. Families who had trusted her now demanded answers. Why had seemingly healthy people suddenly collapsed within days of being placed under her care? When the Davis family deaths were closely examined, suspicions became undeniable. The relatives insisted on an autopsy, and the results were shocking. The organs showed signs of poisoning. This revelation set in motion a full inquiry into Jane's past cases. Investigators began to piece together a horrifying pattern. Patients, friends, even members of her own foster family, all had died after spending time with her. The police confronted Jane, and at first, she remained calm, offering explanations and excuses. But the pressure mounted quickly. Witnesses came forward, describing how Jane had insisted on being alone with the victims during their final hours, how she had administered unusual mixtures of medicine, and how she seemed strangely calm when death came. The walls were closing in. Finally, Jane cracked. In what would later shock the entire nation, she confessed, not just to one murder, not even to a handful, but to more than 30. 31 lives, she claimed, had been taken by her hands. Her words were chilling. She described how she mixed morphine and atropine, how she adjusted doses to prolong suffering, and how she watched with fascination as her victims slipped away. What unsettled investigators even more was her tone. She spoke without shame, without guilt. She even admitted that she found pleasure in climbing into bed beside her victims as they struggled for breath, holding them as life left their bodies. News of her confession spread rapidly. Across America, newspapers carried the story of the nurse who killed for pleasure. Jolly Jane, once a nickname given for her cheerful personality, became a name of horror. Communities that had once trusted her now recoiled in disbelief. How could such darkness hide behind such a warm smile? Her trial became a spectacle. Courtrooms filled with journalists, curious citizens, and grieving families. The prosecution painted her as a monster in disguise, a woman who had used her position of trust to prey on the weak and vulnerable. They detailed each case, presenting the timeline of deaths, the testimonies of witnesses, and the results of autopsies. Piece by piece, the image of Jane Toppan as a caring nurse was destroyed, replaced with the terrifying reality of a serial killer. The defense, however, took a different approach. They argued that Jane was not in her right mind, that her actions were the result of madness rather than malice. Psychiatrists were called to examine her, and their findings only deepened the mystery. Jane herself admitted freely that she knew what she was doing, but she claimed she could not stop herself. She described the overwhelming urges, the thrill she felt, and the emptiness when the killing was done. To some, this was proof of insanity. To others, it was evidence of pure evil. In the end, the court declared her not guilty by reason of insanity. Instead of facing the gallows or life in a traditional prison, Jane Toppan was committed to the Taunton Insane Hospital in Massachusetts. It was there that she would spend the rest of her life. Inside the asylum, Jane remained much the same as she had always been. Nurses and doctors noted her charm, her friendly demeanor. But behind that smile, the darkness never left. On more than one occasion, she was overheard telling staff that she still longed to kill, that she still dreamed of the power she once held over life and death. One chilling statement she made to a doctor echoed through the years. She said that her ambition had been to kill more people, helpless people, than any other man or woman who ever lived. Her words sent shivers through everyone who heard them. Even within the walls of the asylum, Jane Toppan remained a threat in spirit, if not in action. The idea that a nurse, a woman trusted with the care of the sick and vulnerable, had harbored such an ambition haunted the public imagination. She lived in the asylum for more than 3 decades. As the years passed, her story faded from the front pages of newspapers, but in Massachusetts, the name Jolly Jane never completely disappeared. To many, she was the embodiment of betrayal, a reminder that evil can wear the kindest face, and that trust can be the most dangerous weapon of all. Jane Toppan died in 1938 at the age of 84, still confined within the asylum walls. She had outlived many of the doctors and nurses who had once watched over her, and yet she remained, to the very end, the same woman who once confessed so calmly to murder. There were no tears at her passing, no mourning crowds. For most, her death was simply the closing of a dark and unsettling chapter in American history. But the legacy of Jane Toppan lived on. Criminologists studied her case for decades, fascinated by her lack of remorse and her unusual combination of intelligence, charm, and cruelty. Psychologists debated whether she was insane or simply evil beyond comprehension. And for the families who had lost loved ones to her, the scars never fully healed. Today, Jane Toppan is remembered as one of the most notorious female serial killers in history, a woman who poisoned at least 31 people, who confessed with pride, and who lived out her days locked away, unrepentant to the very end. Her story remains a grim warning about trust, about the hidden depths of human cruelty, and about the monsters who walk among us wearing the most disarming smiles.